This is Neil Girrard. I live in Soviet Lincoln, and I am speaking for myself, my wife, and my children, and I am speaking primarily, but not exclusively, to the Lincoln County Commissioners. I am neither a professional speaker nor a professional video maker. This video is our experience, witness, and testimony of our life in Lincoln's Historical District Zone B, and especially how it relates to a particular incident involving L.M. Smith, Chairman of the Lincoln Historical Board. At the January 2018 board meeting, as chairman of the board, Mr. Smith made a comment about our house burning down. It took some time for the rumors to reach us about what he'd said, and it was not until the May meeting that I was finally able to question Smith at the meeting as to exactly what he'd said and what he intended to do. When I questioned him, he voiced his opinion that our house would look better if it burned down. Rather than apologize for making such a stupid remark, as he had previously and privately admitted to another board member that it was, Mr. Smith simply reiterated his opinion, citing his belief that he had a right to free speech. Demonstrating his hypocrisy further, as he stated this, he motioned for the county deputy to silence me and move me and my children who had accompanied me toward the door. Freedom of speech is apparently only a right for Mr. Smith to enjoy. Inalienable rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. This is as American values as it gets, unless you live in Zone B. There you must submit your ideas of life, liberty, and how you want to pursue happiness to the Historical Board. And if your dream doesn't fit into the little box of the current board's interpretation of the ordinance, too bad, so sad. Unless, of course, you have money and lawyers, or can take your agenda to the county commission and get them to overrule the board. When we bought property in Zone B, we saw the pictures of historical houses and believed we could build something similar to what was shown. And we set out to do just that. Even in its unfinished condition, we have been told by many that our house is perhaps the most authentically historic looking in the entire district. What we didn't realize was that we were also being deprived of our American civil liberties and rights. In other contexts, this coercion and confidence game would be called a crime. Now that we know what the game is about, we want our inalienable rights back. Unfair application. In Zone B, there are 3 or perhaps 4 intact houses that might come from the territorial period, along with several places of disintegrating rubble heaps that may or may not come from that time period. There are approximately 200 properties with houses within the historical districts. The ordinance's jurisdiction is based on what tourists might see from the highway and extends to a half-mile on either side of the road. Houses vary as to how much of their property is visible, and obstructive facades and walls and vegetation are accepted as a cover to allow owners to build what they like, so long as it isn't seen from the road. This results in greater application of the ordinance upon those property owners, like ourselves, whose property is more visible from the road. Technology, which was not present in the territorial period, is permitted, but only on an arbitrary basis. Automobiles and electrical and phone wires and poles, which were not invented until after the territorial period had ended, are permitted, but satellite dishes are arbitrarily forbidden. This latter prohibition impacts the properties on the north side of the road, but not those on the south, just as properties that are not visible from the road, even though within the half-mile jurisdiction, are free from the ordinance. Zoning. Since Zone B has no historicity, or at the most a mere 1 to 2% of Zone B might have some real historicity, there is no legal basis for placing or keeping Zone B under historical standards. What is confusing is that zoning laws are the proper legal implement to control what moves into a particular zone. Every city, county, township, or village in the country has passed zoning legislation and is able to maintain control of the various zones, but somehow Lincoln County seems locked into the dark ages and does not have zoning legislation, or so we have been told. Removing Zone B from the historical ordinance, where it does not belong, and zoning it where it does rightly belong, as either single-family residential, with only home-based businesses allowable, or agricultural, while restricting new home construction to something with an old Western flavor, would solve the issues of preserving the flavor, ambience, and environment which tourists, who aren't nearly as discerning or invasive as historical board members, will see from the road. All without keeping the property owners under the oppressive, arbitrary, and dictatorial powers of the historical board. It is insightful to note that most tourists don't even know that the historic zone extends out 5 miles each way along the highway. Some of you commissioners might not even know that. Power. Many people assume that the board doesn't have any real power because the enforcement of the ordinance has been recently reserved for the county code enforcement person to enforce. In either case, though, the usual pattern of activity in the districts show that the personality of the board members and or the enforcement person is the real standard by which the ordinance is enforced. The truth is, however, the board members have powers comparable to judges, and they have power that runs the gamut from the most trivial of matters up to million-dollar projects. These judges, however, don't know law and often do not know even the historical ordinance. They are not held to any standards of obtaining or evaluating evidence, and slander, gossip, rumors, and outright lies, as well as the personal opinions of the board members, are given weight or even used as valid testimony. Violation of the ordinance is a misdemeanor crime, so potentially a resident can end up with a criminal record because of something as trivial as the color of one's house, unless one is part of the historicals party and in good graces with the board and county so that no one presses any complaints. No legal assistance is offered or provided for those who cannot afford it. One reason for this is because the ordinance and district is maintained in such a way that poorer people are quickly made to feel unwelcome and they simply aren't supposed to be in the district. Thus, most people new to the district already have their own legal counsel, or because the matter at first seems straightforward, most don't see their need for legal counsel in their dealings with the board. The result is a government-sanctioned, gated community, and it is heart-wrenching when unsuspecting poorer or disadvantaged people are instructed, coerced, convinced, or pressured to appear alone before the board, in spite of the ordinance's clear statements that no one can be forced to appear before the board. And then they receive no mercy from the board's present interpretation of the ordinance's standards. Some board members seem to feed off the petty control they exercise over their neighbors. It is even more repugnant when board members are just oh so polite and nice and helpful while they separate the property owners from their American constitutional and civil rights and liberties. Too often, neither the board member nor the owner realizes at the time just how deeply both have been cheated and robbed, though the owner is the most aware that something wrong, even evil, has just been done to them. The presence of 5 judges is supposed to eliminate the influence that any one board member can exert upon each situation. But the chairman who becomes accustomed, even addicted, to the feelings of power over one's neighbors that are incorporated into the board meetings becomes dangerous to the community, as the ongoing situations with Reginald Ritchie demonstrated some 10 years ago, and which the most recent statements from L.M. Smith about burning houses again clearly indicates. Even when less obnoxious chairmen, like Tom Mann or Bill Strouser, are in charge, arbitrary decisions places the district under the control of a person and not under the clear wordings of a law. Absolute or unaccountable power still corrupts absolutely. The board provides a cozy, comfortable place for power-hungry, petty despots who cannot otherwise attain to more powerful positions. Tyranny without representation. The board members are appointed by the county commission and are not elected by the people whom the board judges. The people of Lincoln only vote for one of the 5 county commissioners that appoint the board members. This is tyranny without representation. It has been put forth that the village of Lincoln simply cannot afford to have regular elections. If this is so, then the county must pay for the elections, or the board must be dissolved, or at least removed from jurisdiction over Zone B. Democracy may be financially impractical, but it is highly preferable to the tyranny of rogue bureaucrats who are only held accountable for their actions with great difficulty, as this current situation with L.M. Smith clearly evidences. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word we do not mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his own labor, while with others the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are 2 not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty, and it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called by 2 different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. Abraham Lincoln, 1864. Herein lies an essential difference between socialism and democracy, a difference that resulted in untold misery under the Nazis and the Soviets, and that will do the same in this country, and that is one of the most serious defects in the historical ordinance. The liberty enjoyed by the historicals manifests as tyranny upon others, and none of the historical party seems able to understand this, let alone willing to make any changes. Unconstitutional. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, were considered so necessary that many of the colony states refused to ratify the Constitution until they were promised that the Bill of Rights would be attached. The Fifth Amendment requires the government to compensate any property owner whose property is seized by the government. But in the Lincoln historical districts, even though the government enjoys control over what a person's home will look like, no just compensation is provided. Instead, the Zone B properties, which are not even historical, are forced into subservience to the Zone A historical properties and are required to provide ambience, atmosphere, and western environment for the tourist traps of Zone A, often at great expense to the Zone B property owners and always without any just due compensation from the government who upholds and enforces the ordinance. Further, the poorer owners are disproportionately burdened for these expenses, more so than are the wealthier owners. In the same way, a food tax impacts the poor much more so than the wealthy. Though what occurs in Zone B is not a complete seizure of property as the amendment directly addresses, there certainly ought to be some measure of reward or at least incentive for the Zone B owners who are forced to support the Zone A tourist trap owners in their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Partial seizure of property without just cause or due process is just as immoral as is total seizure. Housing discrimination. The term historicity is used to justify the building philosophy of the historical ordinance, but this is merely deception. What is really practiced is Western flavor, nostalgia, and fantasy, and it must be understood that this historical fiction does not enjoy the same protection under the law as does true historical preservation. That is, you cannot call a structure or area historical just because you want it to be historical or because you want a convenient method of control. There are required standards of historicity that are completely ignored in Zone B. Chief among these standards are authenticity and significance. At one end of the historical district, there is a German barn and houses derived from Missouri homesteads. Also in Zone B can be found a neo-modern straw bale breezeway design. There is a California Western log house fantasy, and then there's Reginald Ritchie's Swiss chalet. At the other end of the district is L.M. Smith's new colonial-style mansion with its stucco exterior to make it fit in, and his Pennsylvania Dutch barn, which will never fit in with the historical standards of Lincoln in the territorial period, and an entirely blue house in direct contradiction to the ordinance's earth tones requirement. There are several modern-style stucco buildings that could fit into any modern Western subdivision. There are many older houses that are neither historical nor from the territorial period, just old, and there are at least 2 manufactured house trailers that were grandfathered in when the ordinance was first installed. Many of the newer mansions recently built in Zone B, which there were no mansions built in Lincoln during the territorial period, are simply too large to have been built during the territorial period, but because the owners are wealthy, and like some of the other aberrations mentioned above, because they retain lawyers, the owners were permitted to build contrary to the standard designs of the time period the historical zone purports to adhere to. Allowing these owners to do this over the years has negated and eliminated whatever true historicity might have existed in Zone B, and it has become, literally and visibly, a gated community for the wealthy elite who have moved themselves into Lincoln. So this false historicity is really a contrived method, a scam, by which those who have some wealth, power, and status, at least in Lincoln, can maintain their vision for what they imagine Lincoln should look like. And this infallible vision changes as old board members are replaced by new ones. Simply put, there is no longer any valid historicity left in Zone B, certainly not sufficient enough to justify the draconian control of the historical board. Housing discrimination is further indicated by looking at the statistical average population in America. For every 2 adults, there is at least 1 child, and about half the time there will be 2 children. There are less than 10 children in Lincoln's combined Zone A and B districts. We believe the exact number is 7 or 8. 5 of those children belong to one family, ours. This near total absence of children shows that only certain types buy and keep property in the districts, a type that is catered to and given preferential treatment. The wealthier of the district have no ability or desire to grasp or recognize or address the problems of the district, and because these have more leisure time, they spend more time attempting to influence the county and retain the ordinance. The poor and the working class of the district are all too well aware of the problems within the district, but have little or no time or resources to do much about it, and their voices are generally drowned out and ignored, or they leave and move out. And all the while, the board zealously prevents any new businesses that would conflict with the existing tourist trap businesses from moving in. That might provide the poor and the working class with any viable work options. That is, Zone A businesses that support the illusion of historicity are supported by the ordinance, but anyone who simply wants to have his own business must go elsewhere if it doesn't support the illusion of historicity. The simple truth is that this ordinance is not about historicity, but is about money. It is not about what is best for all, but what is deemed good for a select few. If the ordinance were about historicity, the entire district, and not just what is visible to tourists from the highway, would be kept historical, and each and every property would be held to standards that would make them eligible for the National Registry.